Okay guys, today I'm going to show you how to tie up a foxy GameChanger. I wanted to use a material that everyone has access to, and you don't have to have a special dubbing brush machine to make dubbing brushes or anything like that. You'll be able to make this entire fly with hopefully most of the stuff that you have just at your average tying bench. So I hope you enjoy the tutorial, and hopefully we'll come up with something that looks similar to this. Okay, so to get started, I make all my own shanks out of 140-pound shark wire. This is single strand, pretty tough stuff that you can buy from Bass Pro, Academy, pretty much any outdoor sporting goods place that has a good saltwater fishing selection. So what I'll do is I'll trim off about an inch or so of this 140-pound shark wire, and then I take these 2.25 millimeter loop forming tools. They're made for jewelry, and Sven Diesel showed me this tool, and I've used it to make my shanks ever since then. Usually it has a big loop right here that clips off the wire for you, but that really gets in the way of making shanks, so I took some bolt cutters and snipped it off of there, which was pretty difficult, but and since I did that, it's the perfect tool for creating these little shanks. So all you got to do is take this piece of wire, put it in the tool, and then just squeeze it. You have to make sure the two wires line up right here, otherwise they'll crisscross and then it won't make the little loop properly, but when it does it right, it makes a nice little loop. And then I do it the opposite way as well. Pretty simple. And so when I'm bending it the opposite way, sometimes it's hard to keep those two wires aligned, so I'll pinch it with my wire cutters and then make the loop. So let's get started. I'll put this shank we just made in the vise, and this shank is going to be a little bit longer than some of the other ones that we use because I have to put the entire tail and the first step of the fox onto this shank. So for the tail, I use a turkey flat, and it's got these stiffer fibers up at the front, and I buy this from almost any craft store. I think they call it marabou, but it's really some sort of turkey flat or something very similar. So you'll tie that in by the tip at the back of the shank, and then just wrap those stiffer fibers right at the back. Make sure you're stroking them back as you wrap. And I don't like to get too many of the fluffy fibers in there, so I'll tie it off right about there. And then snip that off. Okay, once you get that tightened down, we're going to use some Farrar Flash Blend as the supporting material underneath the fox. So at the back of each shank in here, it's supported by this flash blend that I spin up in a dubbing loop. So I'll take some of the fibers out and snip it in half a few times. Just keep bending it over. So this first bunch that I put on there is probably going to be just under a ½ inch wide, maybe a little less, probably around 1/3 of an inch. So I'll do a dubbing loop. This is my favorite dubbing twister, and it's made by OPST. You can find it on their website. So I take this flash blend that I've trimmed to this size, stick it in the thread, and make sure you separate the fibers, otherwise they'll want to bunch up. And usually it's best if you have some dubbing wax, but I didn't grab it. I might have to go grab it here in a second. So then you're just going to spin that up and wrap it right in front of that feather you tied in. Make sure you don't crowd the eye of the shank, otherwise you won't be able to wrap the fox fur in front of it. So 2 or 3 wraps, capture it, snip it off, and then wrap back towards the back of the shank to give it a nice clean head where you can tie in the fox. So for the fox, I take a little part of the tail, snip it off, so I've got a bunch about like that, and then I line up the tips, and I'll remove some of the longer guard hairs to try to get to some of the softer fibers down beneath. You can also use body fur that you can buy at the craft store, and it won't have any of the guard hairs, but buying a whole tail is really cheap, and I've found it's a lot better for me. So I'll remove some more of those guard hairs. So make sure you line those tips up. And then I'll snip off all that extra junk at the end. Now I'll make another small dubbing loop. Wrap it back towards those fibers. And spin it up again. So again, you just want, this is the only part that you really want on your fly. All this extra stuff over here is going to be just extra bulk and stuff that you don't need. So make sure you line up these hairs on this side, line up the tips, and then snip that part off as best you can. Now this may not be enough, we may have to add another little bit, but it should be fine for the back. So spin that up and then go ahead and wrap it right in front of the flash blend. That looks fine to me. You don't need it super thick at the back. You want to wrap it thicker as you go forward. So now just add a whip finish and a little bit of UV glue, and then move on to the next shank. So I add the UV glue on top and then just kind of drag it around the entire thread wraps right there. Put a little UV light on it. And that is the tail. And we just got to do 5 more of those. So that's 10 more dubbing loops. And as you can imagine, it's going to take forever. Okay, now I'm going to make the next shank. So the next shank I make is going to be shorter than the one that I used for the tail. And I'm going to do the same thing, just bend it in the little tool right here. If you accidentally bend too much wire, you can just snip off that little excess. Make sure you hook your tail onto the shank before you put it in your vise. And we'll get started on the next step. Go ahead and start your thread base. And I forgot to mention, you definitely want to use gel spun thread when you're working with these pre-made shanks, because it will slice through any regular thread. Because where you snip this wire off, it gets really sharp. So again, we're going to make a little dubbing loop. And this time I grab some tacky wax, put a little bit of that on either side to keep that Steve Farrar blend in place a little better. Do the same thing. Then go ahead and slide it in the dubbing loop. Once I have it in there, I like to trim it. Then go ahead and wrap it on there. You need to grab a brush to brush it out with. You don't want the fibers to all get trapped underneath each other. So you want each wrap to be right in front of the previous one, so touching wraps as you go forward. Capture it again and repeat the process. Okay, so again, I'm going to trim some of the shorter fibers off of this tail. Remove some of the guard hairs if I can. Try to get to some of the softer hairs at the bottom. Set that aside. Make another dubbing loop. Usually you don't have to use wax when you're working with the hair, but when you're working with the SF blend, that's a little bit more difficult, so I'm not going to add any wax right here. Make it just barely longer than how you did the first one. Usually the first two joints I do about the same length, maybe slightly longer right here, with maybe just a slightly denser amount of fur in this loop. And again, just put several wraps right in front of that SF blend, which will prop it up a bit. And the butts that are in there will also give it a nice dense core. Capture that, wrap it back, add a whip finish, and UV glue it. There's two. Go ahead and slide it in, and we'll start on the next shank. And again, it just gets repetitive. You're going to be doing the same thing over and over for at least 4 or 5 shanks in the back. Put down a nice thread base to cover those jagged ends of the wire, otherwise it'll slice through some of your materials. Make a dubbing loop. I've already got some SF fiber trimmed. So as you start to use longer lengths of this SF fiber as you're moving up the fly, what I like to do is trim it in a teardrop shape. Let's put a little wax on there, so that the shorter fibers nearest to the shank are going to support it. So I'll trim it into a triangle with the shorter fibers closer to the shank in the dubbing loop. So these are going to be longer than the ones up here. These shorter fibers are going to be stiffer because there's not as much length to fold over, and it's going to support these longer ones. And this is going to be really important as you start to get further up the fly. But again, I might spread those out a little bit more, especially at the back. Spin it up. Usually I have a brush and brush that out, and then just go ahead and wrap it forward. Okay, that makes a nice little cone that's going to push plenty of water right there. Again, we'll grab some of our Arctic foxtail over here. We're just going to slowly stair step the density and the size as we move up the fly. Still going to remove some guard hairs back here. And just try to get the tips of it lined up. Go ahead and make another dubbing loop. So as you move up the fly, you can leave a little bit of extra length over on this side to start pushing water, because that stuff's going to add some bulk and density in there. So if you want to, you can add that for some water pushing capabilities, but it's just up to you. It can make it harder to wrap, and can get easy to make it too dense. Wrap back over some of this stuff that's sticking out. That's probably a little bit too dense, so what I can do is kind of trim some of this short stuff out by holding down the longer fibers and then just trimming some of the under fur out. Go ahead and whip finish. So again, you're gonna trim it in a triangle back towards the shank so that the shorter fibers are going to support these longer fibers moving forward. And each time you just make them slightly longer, not much at all. As you get further up the fly, you'll have to start leaving some of the longer hairs in so that you can get the length you need. So what I'll start doing right here is trimming this part closer and then leaving some of this part a bit longer so that it adds some density back into the fly right at the back. So this part's going to wrap in there and add some density behind these longer fibers up front. After you capture it, make sure you stroke the fibers back and wrap back up over them. Not too tight, you don't want to really flare the fibers and the hairs, but you do want to force them back a little bit with some thread wraps. Then add a whip finish. Okay, so now that we've finished the back of the fly, I'm taking this is a 5/0 mustad tarpon hook, but it really looks about the same size as your average, say 3/0 or 2/0 Gamakatsu B10S. So this is a new hook for me. I haven't really tied on it very much, and the 5/0 just seemed like the right size. So what I do is I take a inch and a half piece of 7-wire flexible, I think this is 30-pound shark wire. It's flexible leader wire as opposed to the single strand that I use for the shanks. And then I'll wrap that in right on top of the shank. And I wrap down enough to where when I bend it up and make a loop at the back, that loop's going to be directly in line with the shank. So you usually have to wrap down the shank a little bit and then bend the wire back up. So I'll add the tail on right here and make a little bit of a loop at the back and capture it right there, and then wrap back towards the back. That should be good right there. So you want the loop at the back to be straight up and down, so what you can do is go around and under it and then cinch down and then come back over the top, and that'll allow you to make it stand up a little bit more. Essentially you're pulling the wire on this side under the other wire and making them line up straight on top of each other. Now we're going to do the same thing, just add a dubbing loop right here, right at the back without interfering with the loop at the end. You don't want the material to overlap too much and restrict how this moves. And the way you do that is by tapering this SF fiber as you put it in the brush to where there's some short little fibers sticking straight up right there that really support everything else. Again, I taper those fibers back, spin it up. I really should have a brush to brush these out. Normally I do. And if you get them too close like that, you can pull them out. So that means I didn't space them out far enough and didn't have a brush to really brush them. But even when that happens, you can still wrap it tight against there and it should be fine. So right here I wrap it real tight to make those fibers flare out. I'm going to go ahead and wrap back over that a little bit. Just to really get them to flare up. Okay, at this point, I start pulling out the long fibers and then laying them out side by side and really lining up the tips, just to make sure I've got all the long ones in there and not too many of the short ones. Not totally necessary, but I like to do it just to line it all up. Now that I've got the tips all nice and lined up, I can stick it in there and kind of eyeball the taper. Try to make it longer each time, just slightly. And make sure you spread out the fibers so that it can really cinch down on each individual strand of hair. If it starts to clump up, that's when you'll start to lose fibers. The hair will come out while it's swimming. That's no good. So I'll trim a little bit of this, but I'll leave it long enough to add some bulk underneath it. I'll brush it out now that I grabbed a brush. And then go ahead and wrap in front again. Go ahead and and wrap back on top of those fibers a little bit. Keep them pinned back nice and neat. Make a nice little cone right at the front. We've got a nice taper going. Any stray hairs you can pull out. And we'll do one last little bunch of this SF fiber. And one last bit of the fox as well. Again, with the SF fiber, make sure you're spreading it out so that it can not bunch up too much. And trim it back towards the back like that. Do the same thing up here. Go ahead and spin it up. And you'll see I'm adding more SF fiber the further forward I get, the more I add into the loop to add more density, more water pushing capability, and a bit more support since the fibers are getting longer. Go ahead and wrap about a 1/4 inch in front of your last tie-in point and wrap forward. These are going to be spaced pretty close together since we're starting to add some density right here at the head. And you can use any color supporting material that you want. I even use flash, all sorts of stuff, but this SF fiber works really well. It's got a good balance of stiffness and flexibility to still support but swim and push water, and just really good stuff. And we will add our last batch of fox hair. So again, make sure you're lining up the tips. Just slightly longer than the batch before. Trim off some of this excess. And then spread it all out. I'm sure you can see there's a ton of loose hairs floating away. You don't want those in your fly when you're casting it. It's all going to come out in the water, might as well get it out now. Wrap this last little bit right in front of there. I'm going to wrap back over it again, and then we'll add a little bit of SF fiber right in front of this, just to give the eyes something to grab onto when you glue them on. So I'll add some loose wraps to get the fibers to stand down right here at the front. I don't want it to spike up too much. I want it to have more of that teardrop profile. So a little bit more loose wraps right at the base, and then tighten down on it. And now to finish it off, we'll get a last little batch of this SF blend and make a nice little head right at the front. So help it push water, it'll help the eyes to adhere, and generally just help the durability of the fly. So when you're making the head of the fly, it's the opposite of what you've been doing on the back. So normally your teardrop shape is the shorter fibers are closer to the fly. In this case, we want the shorter fibers to be down here, and so we'll trim them at a little bit of an angle so that it gives it a nice teardrop head. So make sure you spread these fibers out. Can't remember if I added any wax to it. I think I want to add some wax. Okay. We'll go ahead and spin that up. As you start spinning, the fibers are going to want to lay down flat up towards the fly, so I like to stroke them back the opposite way and then keep spinning it up. Brush it out a little bit as you go. Make sure you brush out the fibers that are getting trapped right here as well, because some of that fox will get spun up in the thread as well. And then go ahead and wrap right up against that fox with some nice touching wraps right at the head. Build a nice little thread head right at the base there. Go ahead and whip finish. I like to brush it out a little bit before I add the glue, otherwise it can glue the fibers down in some weird spots. And then add a little UV glue for some durability right at the head. Okie dokie, so that's our finished product. It has a decent taper and a nice head that we can add some eyes to, just a little super glue right there. And that is a killer fly for any bass or even the saltwater with this hook. And you can make them bigger, you can make them smaller. I like them right about this size. This one has 6 joints. This one I just tied has 5. And you can play with all sorts of materials underneath the fox that's supporting it, all sorts of different colors. There's really no limit to this style of fly. And as always, huge credit to Blane Chocklett, who I learned some of these techniques from and who developed all this stuff. I'm sure he's tied them just like this and then developed his own ways, but I really like spinning it up in the dubbing loops because I'm able to control the taper a bit better than when I try to fold it back and not spin it up in thread. Takes a little bit longer, but I think it's worth it. Hope y'all enjoy the tutorial and give it a try.